Rebecca Walsh had been a flight attendant for 15 years. She'd worked for Pacific Airways long enough to have flown millions of miles, served thousands of passengers, and developed a sixth sense for trouble. Most flights were routine: passengers boarding, safety demonstrations, beverage service, landing. The same patterns repeated day after day, city after city. After 15 years, Rebecca could do the job on autopilot, but she'd learned never to actually be on autopilot. Years of training and experience had taught her to stay alert, to notice details, to recognize when something felt off. Flight 447 from Phoenix to Seattle on a Tuesday afternoon seemed completely normal. The Boeing 737 had 142 passengers, business travelers, families, a few college students. Rebecca and her crew of 3 other flight attendants went through their pre-flight routine, checking overhead bins, greeting passengers, helping people find their seats. Rebecca was responsible for the forward cabin rows 1 through 15. As passengers boarded, she made mental notes: family with 2 young children in row 3, elderly couple in row 7, solo business travelers scattered throughout, a nervous flyer in row 11 who was already gripping the armrests before they'd even pushed back from the gate. Row 12 had 2 men who'd boarded separately but ended up sitting next to each other. Middle-aged, both in casual business attire, both carrying laptop bags. They exchanged polite nods when one took the window seat and the other the middle seat, but didn't seem to know each other. Nothing unusual, just another routine flight. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway, and took off smoothly. Rebecca and her colleagues went through the safety demonstration, then began preparing for beverage service once they reached cruising altitude. Rebecca was in the galley mixing drinks when she first felt something was wrong. Not anything specific, just an instinct developed over 15 years. The subtle shift in cabin atmosphere that indicated tension or a problem developing. She stepped into the aisle with her beverage cart, scanning the cabin. Everything looked normal. Passengers reading, working on laptops, sleeping, watching the in-flight entertainment. But as Rebecca moved down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks, she noticed the 2 men in row 12 were talking. Not unusual. Passengers often struck up conversations with seatmates, but there was something about their body language, the intensity of their hushed conversation, the way they leaned close to each other, that caught Rebecca's attention. She approached row 12 with her cart. "Can I get you gentlemen anything to drink?" Both men looked up, and Rebecca noticed they seemed annoyed by the interruption. The man in the window seat, early 40s, brown hair, clean cut, forced a smile. Black. The man in the middle seat, slightly older, balding, wearing glasses, said, "Same. Coming right up," Rebecca said pleasantly, pouring their coffees. As she did, she overheard fragments of their conversation. Target-rich environment. Maximum impact. Security won't expect. Rebecca's blood ran cold. Those phrases, in that context, with that tone, they weren't talking about business. They were talking about something violent. She handed them their coffees with steady hands, her face maintaining its professional pleasantness even as her mind raced. She continued down the aisle, finishing beverage service, her movements automatic, while her attention stayed focused on row 12. The men resumed their conversation, leaning close together, occasionally looking at a phone they kept low and between them so others couldn't see the screen. Rebecca's training kicked in. Pacific Airways, like all airlines, had extensive security protocols. Flight attendants were trained to recognize potential threats, to report suspicious behavior, to handle security situations. But this, 2 passengers discussing what sounded like an attack, this was beyond anything Rebecca had encountered in 15 years. She returned to the galley and found her colleague, Michael Chen, organizing drinks. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. Privately, they stepped into the aft galley, out of passenger earshot. Rebecca explained what she'd overheard. Michael's expression grew serious. "You're sure about what you heard?" "I'm sure they said target-rich environment, and maximum impact, and security won't expect." "That's not business talk, Michael. That's attack planning." "Could they be military? Or law enforcement? Maybe discussing past operations?" Rebecca had considered that. Maybe. But the way they're talking, present tense, planning mode, looking at what seems like blueprints or maps on a phone, this feels like they're planning something now. Something on this flight, or at our destination. Michael looked through the galley curtain toward row 12. "Protocol says we report to the captain immediately. Let me get Sarah to cover service while we go to the cockpit." Captain David Morrison and First Officer Jennifer Park listened carefully as Rebecca and Michael reported what Rebecca had overheard. Morrison's expression remained calm. Pilots were trained not to panic, but Rebecca could see the concern in his eyes. "You're certain about the exact phrases?" Morrison asked. "Target-rich environment, maximum impact, security won't expect," Rebecca confirmed. "I know it could be innocent, but Captain, my instincts are screaming that something's wrong." Morrison made a decision. "Okay, Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm notifying Seattle Approach Control and having them alert airport security and law enforcement. Second, we're going to have you two watch those passengers very carefully but discreetly. Third, and this stays absolutely confidential, we have an air marshal on this flight. Rebecca felt relief. Federal air marshals were undercover law enforcement officers who flew on certain flights to protect against hijackings and terrorism. She'd known there was probably one on board but hadn't known which passenger it was. Seat 8B, Morrison said. Hispanic male, mid-40s, black jacket. His name is Jake Rodriguez. I'm going to signal him to come to the cockpit. You two return to the cabin and continue normal service. Watch row 12 but don't let them know you're watching. Rebecca and Michael returned to the cabin. A few minutes later, the passenger from 8B, Jake Rodriguez, casually stood and walked toward the forward lavatory, which was right next to the cockpit. Instead of entering the lavatory, he was quietly admitted to the cockpit. Rebecca continued her duties, making another pass through the cabin with water refills. As she approached row 12, she heard more of their conversation. When we land, separate exits. Timing is critical. They'll never see it coming. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she offered them water. Both men declined without looking up from their phone screen. She returned to the galley where Jake Rodriguez was now standing, having exited the cockpit. He looked like any ordinary passenger, unremarkable, forgettable, perfect for an undercover air marshal. Rebecca Walsh? He asked quietly, showing her his badge discreetly. Tell me everything you heard. Exact words if possible. Rebecca repeated the conversation fragments, the body language, the intensity of their discussion, the phone screen they were studying. Rodriguez's expression grew grave. I'm going to walk past them, see if I can observe what they're looking at. If they're planning an attack, we need to know if it's targeting this flight or something at Seattle-Tacoma Airport when we land. What if it's this flight? Rebecca asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if they're planning to do something now? Then we stop them, Rodriguez said simply. But we need more information first. Can't arrest people for having a conversation. We need clear evidence of intent to commit a crime. He casually walked down the aisle, past row 12, toward the aft lavatory. Rebecca watched from the galley. Rodriguez's eyes flicked toward the two men as he passed, but his expression remained neutral. When he returned, he pulled Rebecca into the galley. They've got architectural plans on the phone. Looked like a building layout. I couldn't see enough detail to identify what building, but combined with their conversation, this is serious. He pulled out his own phone. Air marshals had special communication devices that worked on aircraft. I'm updating the Tactical Operations Center. They'll coordinate with Seattle PD and FBI. We're gonna let these guys think everything's normal. Then we'll have a reception committee waiting when we land. But what if they try something before we land? Rebecca asked. We've still got 90 minutes of flight time. Then I handle it, Rodriguez said. That's my job. But your job is crucial too. Keep watching them. If their behavior changes, if they get up, if they reach for anything, if they do anything that suggests immediate threat, you signal me immediately. Got it? Rebecca nodded. How do I signal you? Make an announcement about turbulence and ask everyone to return to their seats. That's the code. I'll know to respond. The next hour was the longest of Rebecca's life. She went through the motions of her job, collecting trash, offering drinks, smiling at passengers, all while keeping row 12 under constant but discreet observation. The two men continued their intense conversation. At one point, one pulled out a notebook and seemed to be writing down times or numbers. The other nodded, made notes on his phone. Rebecca noticed they kept checking their watches, synchronizing something. That detail made her stomach churn. Synchronized timing suggested coordinated action. She made another pass through the cabin, and as she approached row 12, she heard, "My brother will be in position. The target opens at 9 a.m. We hit during maximum occupancy." Rebecca felt dizzy. This wasn't a plan for the flight. This was a plan for something after they landed. Something coordinated. Something involving maximum casualties. She returned to the galley and caught Rodriguez's eye. He met her there. They're planning something for after we land, Rebecca whispered urgently. I heard them mention the target opens at 9 a.m. and maximum occupancy. And one of them has a brother who'll be in position. This is coordinated. Multiple people. Rodriguez's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone and sent a rapid series of messages. TOAC is looping an FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. We're going to have a full tactical response ready when we land. These guys won't make it past the gate. But what about the brother? Rebecca asked. What about whoever else is part of this? If we arrest these two, won't that alert the others? Rodriguez nodded grimly. That's the dilemma. If we let these guys go to see where they lead us, we risk them executing their plan. If we arrest them immediately, we might not catch their accomplices. FBI will have to make that call. 45 minutes to landing. Rebecca felt every minute tick by. The two men in row 12 seemed relaxed now, their conversation less intense. They'd moved from planning to preparation mode. They'd finalized their plan. Now they were just waiting to execute it. Rebecca noticed something else. Both men kept looking toward the aft cabin. Following their gaze, Rebecca realized they were looking at seat 22C, a younger man, maybe late 20s, who was reading a book. He hadn't drawn any attention during the flight. But the men in row 12 kept glancing his way. Rebecca walked to the aft galley and told Sarah Lee, the flight attendant covering that section. The passenger in 22C, has he done anything unusual? Talked to anyone? Made any phone calls? Sarah thought about it.
No, he's been reading the whole flight. Polite when I offered drinks. Why? The two suspicious passengers in row 12 keep looking at him. I think he might be with them. Rebecca returned to the forward galley and updated Rodriguez. There's potentially a third person involved. Seat 22C. The men in row 12 keep looking at him. Rodriguez processed this information. Classic cell structure. 3 people traveling separately, not communicating directly during the flight, but coordinating. Makes them harder to detect. He sent more messages on his phone. 20 minutes to landing. The captain made the announcement asking passengers to return to their seats and prepare for landing. Rebecca and her colleagues secured the cabin, checking seatbelts, collecting final trash, stowing loose items. As Rebecca checked row 12, both men were now completely calm. One was reading a magazine. The other had his eyes closed, resting. They looked like any ordinary passengers preparing to land. But Rebecca had heard their conversation. She knew what they were planning, and she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport smoothly. As they taxied to the gate, the captain made an unusual announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor mechanical issue that needs to be inspected before we can taxi to the gate. We'll be holding on the taxiway for just a few minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your patience. There was no mechanical issue. This was the plan. Hold the aircraft away from the terminal while law enforcement assembled their response. Rebecca looked out the window and saw what passengers couldn't see from their seats. A dozen unmarked vehicles surrounding the aircraft. FBI, ATF, local police, Seattle Port Authority, a full tactical response team. The passengers were restless. Nobody likes delays after landing. But they had no idea what was happening. Rodriguez stood and stretched, the casual movement of a passenger tired from the flight. But Rebecca saw him subtly adjust his position so he had clear lines of sight to both row 12 and row 22. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes. Passengers were getting irritated, asking flight attendants what was happening. Rebecca and her colleagues gave the same scripted answer. Maintenance is just doing a final check. We'll be moving to the gate very soon. Finally, the aircraft door opened. But instead of a jet bridge, what appeared were federal agents in tactical gear. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the FBI, announced the lead agent. We need everyone to remain seated. We will be removing certain passengers from the aircraft. This is a routine security matter. Please remain calm and follow all instructions. Agents moved swiftly down the aisle. They reached row 12. Gentlemen, please stand up slowly and keep your hands visible, the lead agent commanded. The man in the window seat, Thomas Reed, Rebecca would later learn, tried to protest. What is this about? We haven't done anything. You're being detained for questioning. Come with us, now. The two men were handcuffed and escorted off the aircraft. Passengers watched in shocked silence. The agents then moved to row 22. The young man Michael Stevens was also removed in handcuffs. After the 3 suspects were removed, the lead FBI agent addressed the passengers. Thank you for your cooperation. There is no threat to this aircraft, or to any of you. You'll be able to deplane normally in just a few minutes. If anyone saw or heard anything unusual during this flight involving the passengers who were removed, please identify yourself to an agent at the gate. The aircraft finally pulled to the gate. As passengers deplaned, confused, scared, full of questions, Rebecca and her crew were held back for debriefing. Special Agent Michelle Torres from the FBI interviewed Rebecca. Miss Walsh, your observation and quick reporting potentially stopped a major terrorist attack. The men we arrested were planning to bomb the Seattle Convention Center tomorrow morning during a technology conference with over 3,000 attendees. We found detailed plans, timing schedules, and preliminary explosive materials in their luggage. Rebecca felt like she might faint. A bomb. They were planning to bomb a conference. A coordinated triple bombing actually. Agent Torres explained. 3 entry points. Time to go off simultaneously during maximum occupancy. Your intercepted conversation gave us enough evidence to arrest them before they could execute the plan. We're currently rounding up their support network based on phone records and communications we seized. She looked at Rebecca seriously. You saved thousands of lives today. By trusting your instincts, reporting what you heard, and helping our air marshal gather evidence, you stopped an attack that would have been one of the deadliest in recent history. Over the next several days, as FBI investigated Thomas Reed, Michael Stevens, and their third accomplice, identified as James Peterson, the man from the middle seat in row 12, the full scope of the plot emerged. The 3 men were part of a domestic extremist group that had been planning the attack for months. They'd chosen the Seattle Technology Leadership Conference because it represented what they viewed as symbols of corporate and government power they opposed. They'd packed explosive materials in checked luggage, carefully disguised, and in quantities small enough to not trigger automatic detection systems. Once in Seattle, they planned to assemble 3 devices at different locations, then deploy them at the convention center the next morning. The target opening at 9 a.m. that Rebecca had overheard was the conference registration. Maximum occupancy would have been around 10 a.m. when keynote presentations began. They'd planned 3 simultaneous explosions: main entrance, ground floor atrium, and second floor conference hall. Estimated casualties if successful, over 500 dead, 2,000 injured. Their plan was sophisticated, Agent Torres told Rebecca during a follow-up interview. They'd studied previous attacks, learned from others' mistakes. They traveled separately, didn't communicate directly during the flight, carried materials that individually looked innocent. If you hadn't overheard their conversation and recognized it as concerning, we would have had no warning. Rebecca struggled to process it. She'd been serving drinks and snacks while 3 terrorists planned a mass casualty attack. She'd been 30,000 feet in the air with people plotting to kill thousands. Could they have attacked the plane itself? Rebecca asked. We don't think that was their plan, Torres said, but they had the materials. If they'd realized we were onto them, if things had gone wrong, they might have tried something desperate. Your air marshal was prepared for that scenario, but thankfully it didn't come to that. Rebecca met with Jake Rodriguez, the air marshal, a few days later. You kept your cool perfectly, he told her. In 15 years of flying as an air marshal, I've never had a flight attendant spot a threat that credibly that I'd missed. You have exceptional instincts. I almost convinced myself I was overreacting, Rebecca admitted. I almost talked myself out of reporting it, but you didn't, Rodriguez said. That's what matters. You trusted your training and your instincts. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. The arrests made national headlines. Terror plot foiled on Pacific Airways flight. Dominated news cycles for days. The FBI praised flight crew vigilance. The airline industry highlighted it as validation of their security training programs. Rebecca found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Media wanted interviews. Pacific Airways wanted to use her in training materials. The FBI wanted her to speak at their academy about recognizing suspicious behavior. She declined most requests. She wasn't comfortable with the attention. She'd just done her job, noticed something concerning and reported it. That shouldn't be extraordinary. That should be standard. But Pacific Airways gave her their highest honor, the Outstanding Service Award for exceptional vigilance and courage in preventing a potential terrorist attack. The ceremony was attended by airline executives, FBI officials, and representatives from the Transportation Security Administration. Rebecca Walsh represents the best of airline security, said the Pacific Airways CEO. She was trained to recognize threats. She paid attention. She reported concerns through proper channels, and her actions directly prevented a catastrophic attack. She is a hero, whether she accepts that title or not. Rebecca stood at the podium, uncomfortable with the praise. I'm not a hero. I'm a flight attendant who overheard something concerning and reported it. That's what we're trained to do. That's what every flight attendant should do. She paused. But I want to address something important. I almost didn't report it. I almost convinced myself I was overreacting, that I'd misheard, that it was none of my business. I was scared of being wrong, of causing a scene over nothing, of inconveniencing passengers. Rebecca looked at the audience, full of flight attendants, pilots, and airline personnel. How many times do we talk ourselves out of reporting concerns? How many times do we see something suspicious and decide it's probably nothing? How many times do we choose convenience over safety? Her voice grew passionate. 3,000 people were going to die if those bombs had gone off. 3,000 people going to a technology conference. Parents, children, colleagues, friends. They're alive today because I made the uncomfortable choice to report something I wasn't completely sure about. She looked directly at her fellow flight attendants. Trust your instincts. Trust your training. If something feels wrong, report it. Yes, you might be wrong sometimes. Yes, it might be inconvenient. Yes, you might feel foolish, but those consequences are nothing compared to the lives that could be lost if you stay silent when you're right. Rebecca's case became a centerpiece of aviation security training. The FAA and TSA studied what had happened, identifying both successes and areas for improvement. Successes. Law enforcement response was coordinated and effective. Threat was neutralized without passenger harm. Areas for improvement. Successes. Flight attendant recognized suspicious conversation. Proper reporting protocol was followed. Air marshal was effectively utilized. She worked with FBI behavioral analysts, TSA officials, and aviation security experts to create a comprehensive program. The training covered verbal indicators, keywords and phrases associated with attack planning, behavioral indicators, unusual passenger interactions, suspicious timing, coordinated movements, pre-flight screening, recognizing concerning ticket purchase patterns, unusual travel behaviors, in-flight observation techniques, how to watch passengers without being obvious, reporting protocols, when and how to escalate concerns, coordination with air marshals, how to identify and communicate with them, de-escalation techniques, if passengers become aware they're being watched. Pacific Airways implemented the training for all flight attendants. Other airlines followed. Within 2 years, the program became industry standard across major U.S. carriers. What Rebecca did needs to become normal, not exceptional, said Admiral James Wilson, TSA administrator. Flight attendants are the first line of defense against in-flight threats. They need to be trained observers, empowered to report concerns, and confident in their judgments. This training makes that possible, but Rebecca pushed for something more. Public awareness. She believed passengers also had a role to play in flight security. She worked with TSA to develop the Pika Sainsusti Aware Passengers campaign, teaching travelers to notice unusual behavior around them, report concerns to flight attendants, understand their partners in security, not just passive passengers, know how to respond if there's an emergency. Security isn't just the responsibility of crew, Rebecca said in campaign materials. Everyone on that aircraft has a stake in keeping it safe. If you see something suspicious, tell a flight attendant. We'll handle it professionally and discreetly. Your observation might save lives. but the experience took a toll on Rebecca that wasn't visible in public ceremonies and training sessions. She'd come within hours of potentially being on an aircraft with active terrorists. She'd served coffee to men planning mass murder. She'd smiled at people who wanted to kill thousands. She started having panic attacks before flights. She'd look at passengers boarding and wonder if any of them were threats. She'd overanalyze every conversation she overheard. She became hypervigilant to the point of exhaustion. Her husband David noticed she wasn't sleeping well. "You're having nightmares," he said gently. "You wake up several times a night. You need to talk to someone." Rebecca resisted at first. She was supposed to be the hero. Heroes didn't need therapy, but her anxiety got worse, not better. Finally, she saw a therapist who specialized in trauma. "You experienced a life-threatening situation," Dr. Patricia Lee explained. "You were on an aircraft with terrorists. Even though nothing violent happened, your brain registered it as mortal danger. That's why you're having this response." Dr. Lee helped Rebecca understand that her hypervigilance, while uncomfortable, was her brain trying to protect her. "You noticed a threat that others missed. Your brain learned being alert saves lives. Now it's being alert all the time, even when there's no threat. We need to help it recalibrate." Through therapy, Rebecca learned to manage her anxiety. She learned that being vigilant didn't mean being constantly terrified. She learned to trust her training without being consumed by paranoia. It took time, months of therapy, support from her family, understanding from her employer, but gradually, Rebecca found her equilibrium. She could fly again without panic. She could observe passengers professionally, without assuming everyone was a threat. "The experience changed me," Rebecca told Dr. Lee during one session. "I'll never be as carefree as I was before, but maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe a little vigilance, balanced with perspective, makes me better at my job."
2 years after the incident, Rebecca received an email from a flight attendant named Maria Sanchez, who worked for another airline. "Ms. Walsh, I completed your security training 6 months ago. Last week, I had a situation on my flight that reminded me of what happened on your flight. 2 passengers were having an intense, whispered conversation that included phrases like immigration facility and extraction plan, and timing is critical. Because of your training, I recognized these as potential indicators. I reported to the captain, who notified authorities. When we landed, both passengers were detained. Turns out they were planning to break someone out of an immigration detention facility using forged documents and inside help. We stopped a prison break and potentially a violent confrontation. But I wouldn't have noticed if not for your training teaching me to pay attention to concerning conversations. You didn't just stop one attack, you created a system that's stopping many threats. Thank you." That email was the first of many. Rebecca heard from dozens of flight attendants who'd identified potential threats after completing her training. A flight attendant who recognized human trafficking when she noticed an older man controlling a young woman's movements and not letting her speak. An attendant who identified a passenger carrying forged identification documents. One who noticed a passenger researching how to breach cockpit doors during flight. Another who recognized coordinated behavior suggesting a planned hijacking. Not all reports led to arrests. Some were false alarms, but enough were legitimate threats that the training's value was undeniable. "You've created a network of trained observers throughout the aviation system," said James Martinez, security director for the Flight Attendants Association. "Tens of thousands of flight attendants now watching for threats with educated eyes. That's a massive force multiplier for aviation security." But Rebecca emphasized that this wasn't about creating paranoia. The goal isn't to suspect every passenger. The goal is to recognize genuine indicators of potential threats. Most flights are completely safe. Most passengers are just people going about their lives. But occasionally, there's a real threat, and when there is, we need to be prepared to recognize and respond to it. Rebecca's case sparked broader conversations about security in public spaces. If flight attendants could be trained to recognize threats, why couldn't other public-facing workers receive similar training? She was invited to work with the Department of Homeland Security on expanding threat recognition training to train conductors and station personnel, bus drivers and transit workers, hotel staff, convention center employees, sports venue workers, concert and event staff. "Anywhere large numbers of people gather, there's potential for attacks," explained Admiral Wilson. "We can't have armed security everywhere, but we can have aware, trained civilians who know what to look for and how to report it." Rebecca helped adapt her aviation training for these different contexts. The core principles remained the same. Runkle soothing. Recognize concerning behavior and conversation. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Report through proper channels. Don't confront potential threats directly. Understand you're part of a security system, not a vigilante. The programs launched in major cities across the country. Within 3 years, over 200,000 public-facing workers had completed threat recognition training based on Rebecca's model. The documented results included Runkle 7 potential attacks identified and prevented, 89 arrests related to terrorism planning or execution, Hundreds of other criminal activities detected: smuggling, trafficking, fraud, significant increase in public tips to terrorism hotlines, enhanced coordination between private sector and law enforcement. Rebecca Walsh's observation on Flight 447 didn't just stop one attack, said FBI Director Catherine Chang. It sparked a national conversation about vigilance and created training systems that have prevented dozens of attacks and saved countless lives. That's transformative impact. 5 years after Flight 447, Rebecca received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, for her contributions to aviation and public security. Standing in the White House, Rebecca felt overwhelmed. She was just a flight attendant. She'd just overheard a conversation and reported it. How had that turned into this? Rebecca Walsh represents the power of ordinary citizens to prevent extraordinary harm, the president said at the ceremony. A flight attendant who paid attention, recognized danger, reported through proper channels, and helped law enforcement prevent a terrorist attack that would have killed thousands. Her subsequent work developing threat recognition training has created a national network of vigilant citizens protecting our communities. After the ceremony, Rebecca was interviewed by a reporter. How does it feel to be called a hero? Rebecca gave the same answer she'd been giving for 5 years. I'm not a hero. I'm someone who was trained to recognize threats, happened to overhear something concerning, and reported it. Any flight attendant with proper training could have done the same thing. But the reporter pushed back. But many flight attendants might have overheard that conversation and done nothing. What made you act when others might not have? Rebecca thought about that. I almost didn't act. I almost talked myself out of reporting it. I was scared of being wrong, of causing unnecessary alarm, of looking foolish. But I realized that being wrong was acceptable. Letting a potential threat go unreported was not. That's the lesson I try to teach. When in doubt, report. The consequences of being wrong are minor compared to the consequences of staying silent when you're right. She continued. I think what made me act was understanding that I had a responsibility. I was in a position to potentially prevent harm. Having that ability creates an obligation to use it. Yes, it was uncomfortable. Yes, I wasn't certain. But I had enough concern to justify reporting, and that was enough. 7 years after Flight 447, Rebecca's training program faced criticism similar to what other vigilance programs had encountered: concerns about profiling, false accusations, and surveillance culture. A coalition of civil rights organizations published a report documenting cases where flight attendants trained in Rebecca's methods had made reports based on racial, ethnic, or religious bias rather than actual threatening behavior. Middle Eastern passengers reported for speaking Arabic and praying. Hispanic passengers reported for traveling in groups and speaking Spanish. Muslim passengers reported for wearing traditional dress and reading Quran. Sikh passengers reported for wearing turbans mistaken for extremist indicators. Rebecca Walsh's training, while well-intentioned, has contributed to discriminatory profiling of minority passengers, said Omar Hassan, director of the Civil Aviation Rights Coalition. Flight attendants are reporting people for their ethnicity, language, or religion, not for actual threatening behavior. Rebecca was devastated by these reports. Her training explicitly stated that ethnicity, religion, and language were not threat indicators. But clearly some people were misapplying the concepts. She immediately reached out to the coalition. You're right that there have been problems. I take responsibility for not addressing bias prevention more explicitly in the training. I want to fix this. Working together, they revised the training to include plot, extensive modules on implicit bias and how it affects perception, case studies showing both appropriate and inappropriate reports, clear guidelines distinguishing between concerning behavior and cultural practices, emphasis on specific, observable actions rather than demographic characteristics, accountability measures for discriminatory reporting, training on religious practices, cultural differences, and linguistic diversity. Threat recognition must never become an excuse for profiling, Rebecca stated in the revised training. The men I overheard on Flight 447 were white Americans speaking English. Terrorists come from all backgrounds. What makes someone suspicious isn't their ethnicity or religion, it's their behavior, their conversations, their actions. She incorporated testimony from passengers who'd been wrongly reported. One was Ahmed Rahman, a Muslim American software engineer who'd been detained after a flight attendant reported him for suspicious behavior, which turned out to be him praying quietly in his seat. I was humiliated, Ahmed told training classes Rebecca brought him to speak at. Removed from the aircraft, questioned by FBI, missed my connection, all because I was praying. That flight attendant saw a Muslim man praying and assumed terrorism. That's not vigilance, that's bigotry. Ahmed worked with Rebecca to help flight attendants understand the difference. If someone is praying, that's religious observance, not suspicious. If someone is speaking Arabic, that's language, not conspiracy. If someone is wearing traditional dress, that's cultural practice, not extremism. You need concrete behavioral indicators, not demographic assumptions. The revised training significantly reduced discriminatory reports while maintaining effectiveness at identifying actual threats.
False report rates dropped from 18% to 7%, while legitimate threat identification remained steady. This is how responsible security training evolves, said Sarah Martinez, director of the ACLU's National Security Project. Rebecca acknowledged the problem, worked with affected communities to understand it, and made substantive changes. That's accountability. As Rebecca approached 20 years as a flight attendant, she began thinking about succession. Her training program had grown beyond what one person could manage. She needed to develop the next generation of trainers and advocates. She created a master trainer certification program, teaching experienced flight attendants not just how to recognize threats, but how to teach others to recognize them. The first class included 30 flight attendants from various airlines, all with at least 10 years of experience and demonstrated commitment to aviation security. One trainee was Monica Chen, a flight attendant who had identified a human trafficking situation on her flight after completing Rebecca's initial training. Rebecca's program saved a 17-year-old girl on my flight, Monica told the class. A man was controlling her movements, not letting her speak, seemed to be transporting her. I recognized the indicators because of Rebecca's training. That girl is safe now because I knew what to look for. Monica became one of Rebecca's most effective trainers, bringing her own experience to the program. I teach people what Rebecca taught me. Pay attention, trust your instincts, report concerns. But I also teach them what I learned through my own experience. That moment of hesitation when you're not sure if you should report something. How to push through that hesitation and act anyway. Rebecca also partnered with aviation universities and flight attendant training programs to incorporate threat recognition into initial training rather than as continuing education. We need new flight attendants entering the profession already equipped with these skills, Rebecca argued. Security awareness shouldn't be an add-on. It should be foundational. Within 5 years, threat recognition training based on Rebecca's model was incorporated into flight attendant training programs at every major U.S. airline and at dozens of international carriers. Rebecca created a legacy that will outlast her individual career, said Thomas Anderson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants. Generations of flight attendants will be trained in her methods. The culture of aviation security has permanently shifted because of her work. 8 years after Flight 447, Rebecca was invited to a special event in Seattle, a ceremony honoring the first responders and security personnel who had responded to the foiled attack. Jake Rodriguez, the air marshal from Flight 447, was there. So was FBI Special Agent Michelle Torres, Captain David Morrison, First Officer Jennifer Park, and several of the FBI agents who had conducted the arrests. But the most meaningful attendees were the people who had been registered for the technology conference that would have been bombed. Over 200 of them came to the ceremony, representing the thousands who would have been there that day. One woman, Catherine Lee, approached Rebecca with tears in her eyes. I was supposed to be at that conference. I had registered, bought my ticket, made hotel reservations. I would have been in the main atrium at 10 a.m. when those bombs were supposed to go off. She grabbed Rebecca's hands. I have 2 daughters, 8 and 10 years old. They still have their mother because you overheard a conversation on an airplane and reported it. My husband still has his wife. My parents still have their daughter. My girls are going to grow up with a mom because you paid attention. Catherine wasn't the only one. Person after person approached Rebecca with similar stories. They'd been registered for the conference. They would have been in the building. They were alive because Rebecca had acted. One man, Robert Chang, said, I was supposed to give the keynote address that morning. 9 a.m. Main hall, 1,500 people in the audience. The bombs were timed to go off during peak attendance. I've spent 8 years thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't overheard those men. Me, dead. My wife, a widow. My kids, fatherless. 1,500 people in that hall, dead or injured. Thousands more throughout the building. All of us are here because you noticed something and reported it. Jake Rodriguez spoke at the ceremony. I was the air marshal on Flight 447. My job was to protect that aircraft and its passengers from hijacking or attack. But the threat that day wasn't to the aircraft. It was to thousands of people at a conference. I would have never known about it if Rebecca hadn't overheard that conversation and reported it to the captain. She saved more lives that day than I could have. Agent Torres added, the FBI has sophisticated systems for detecting terrorist threats. We monitor communications, track suspicious activities, analyze patterns, but we missed this one. These men communicated carefully, kept low profiles, didn't trigger our systems. The only way we caught them was through Rebecca Walsh's observation on an airplane. Human vigilance caught what technology missed. Captain Morrison concluded, aviation security is a system. Technology, protocols, regulations, law enforcement, all essential. But the most important component is people. People like Rebecca who pay attention, trust their training, and have the courage to report concerns. That human element is irreplaceable. A decade after Flight 447, researchers at the National Security Studies Center conducted a comprehensive analysis of Rebecca's impact on aviation and public security. The findings were remarkable. Direct impact. Dawn terrorist plot foiled. Flight 447. 3 terrorists arrested and convicted. Estimated 3,000 plus lives saved from convention center attack. Training impact. 1,506 potential attacks identified through trained observers, 387 arrests related to terrorism, trafficking, and other serious crimes. Cultural impact. Fundamental shift in aviation security culture. Greater emphasis on human observation versus technology alone. Enhanced coordination between aviation workers and law enforcement. Increased public awareness of see something, say something principles. Systemic impact. Enhanced TSA protocols for in-flight threat assessment. International adoption of threat recognition training standards. Integration of human factors into security system design. Rebecca Walsh's observation on one flight created ripples that have protected millions of people over the past decade, concluded Dr. James Wilson, lead researcher. The training systems she helped develop, the cultural changes she inspired, and the awareness she created have made aviation and public spaces significantly safer. That's transformative impact. As Rebecca approached retirement after 25 years as a flight attendant, she reflected on the journey that had started with one overheard conversation a decade earlier. She was sitting in her home in Seattle, looking at the awards and recognition she'd received over the years. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, the FAA Distinguished Service Award, honorary degrees from 2 universities, plaques from law enforcement agencies, letters from survivors of prevented attacks. But what meant most to her were the simpler things. Emails from flight attendants who'd identified threats using her training, thank you notes from passengers whose lives had been saved, photos from the 200-plus convention attendees who'd organized an annual reunion to celebrate being alive. Her husband David found her there, looking contemplative. "What are you thinking about?" "About how close I came to not reporting what I heard," Rebecca admitted. "I stood in that galley for probably 2 full minutes debating whether to say something. I talked myself through every reason not to report. Maybe I misheard. Maybe they were talking about something innocent. Maybe I'd cause a scene over nothing. Maybe I'd look foolish." She paused. "I almost chose comfort over vigilance. I almost let fear of being wrong stop me from potentially being right. And if I had made that choice, 3,000 people would have died. But you didn't," David said gently. "You chose courage. You reported what you heard, and everything that came after, all the lives saved, all the threats prevented, all the people trained, it all started with that choice." Rebecca nodded. "That's what I try to help people understand. These big outcomes, stopping attacks, saving thousands of lives, they don't start with big dramatic actions. They start with small, uncomfortable choices. Noticing something concerning, reporting it even when you're not sure, trusting your training and instincts over your fear of being wrong." She looked at David. "I'm proud of the training program and the lives it saved. But what I'm most proud of is demonstrating that ordinary people in ordinary jobs have the power to prevent extraordinary harm. You don't need to be law enforcement or military or intelligence. You just need to pay attention and have the courage to speak up." Rebecca's final flight as a flight attendant was designated as a special ceremony flight, Flight 447, the same flight number as the one where she'd overheard the terrorist plot a decade earlier. Pacific Airways filled the flight with people whose lives had been touched by Rebecca's work, survivors of the foiled convention center attack, flight attendants she'd trained, law enforcement officers she'd worked with, family members of people who would have died if the attack had succeeded. Jake Rodriguez, now retired from the Air Marshal Service, was on board. Agent Torres, now assistant director of the FBI. Captain Morrison, also retired. Dozens of flight attendants who'd identified threats after completing Rebecca's training. And in seat 12A, the same seat where Thomas Reed had sat a decade earlier, planning mass murder, sat Catherine Lee, the woman with 2 daughters who would have been at the conference. As Rebecca made her final walk down the aisle in uniform, passengers stood and applauded. She was crying, overwhelmed by the emotion. She stopped at row 12. Catherine Lee stood and hugged her. "Thank you," Catherine whispered. "Thank you for giving me 10 more years with my daughters. Thank you for letting me see them grow up. Thank you for saving my life, and the lives of thousands of others." Rebecca couldn't speak. She just held Catherine and cried. After the flight landed in Seattle, Rebecca's colleagues, the passengers, and a crowd of well-wishers were waiting at the gate. A reception had been organized to honor Rebecca's retirement and her contributions to aviation security. As Rebecca walked through the terminal in uniform for the last time, she thought about her 25-year career. She'd flown millions of miles, served hundreds of thousands of passengers, worked countless flights that were completely routine and unmemorable. But one flight, Flight 447, one Tuesday afternoon a decade ago, had been different. One conversation overheard, one decision to report, one moment of choosing vigilance over convenience. And that one moment had changed everything. 5 years after her retirement, Rebecca was invited to speak at a national aviation security conference. Now 70 years old, she rarely made public appearances anymore. But this one was special. It was the 15th anniversary of Flight 447. Standing before an audience of airline executives, security professionals, and government officials, Rebecca felt the weight of those 15 years. 15 years ago, she began. "I was a flight attendant on a routine flight from Phoenix to Seattle. I overheard two passengers discussing what sounded like an attack. I wasn't certain what I'd heard. I wasn't sure if I should report it. I was scared of being wrong, of causing unnecessary alarm, of looking foolish. She paused, but I reported it anyway. And that decision led to the arrest of 3 terrorists, the prevention of a bombing that would have killed thousands, and ultimately to changes in how the entire aviation industry approaches security. Rebecca looked around the room. I've spent 15 years traveling, speaking, training people to be vigilant. I've told the story of Flight 447 hundreds of times. But what I want to emphasize today is this. I wasn't special. I wasn't uniquely skilled. I was just a flight attendant who was trained to recognize threats, who happened to overhear something concerning, and who chose to report it despite my doubts. She clicked to a slide showing statistics. In the 15 years since Flight 447, flight attendants and other public-facing workers trained in threat recognition have identified 423 potential attacks. That's 423 plots foiled, thousands of lives saved, hundreds of terrorists arrested, all because ordinary people paid attention and reported concerns. Another slide showed faces, survivors, families, communities that had been protected. These aren't just numbers, these are lives. Parents who got to see their children grow up, children who didn't lose parents, spouses who didn't become widows or widowers, communities that weren't devastated by violence, all protected because someone noticed something and spoke up. Rebecca's voice grew passionate. I can't stand here and tell you that I'm a hero. What I can tell you is that I made a choice 15 years ago that any trained, aware person could make. And I've spent the years since trying to empower more people to make similar choices. She looked directly at the audience. Every person in this room has the power to prevent harm, not through extraordinary actions but through ordinary vigilance, through paying attention, through trusting your training and instincts, through choosing to report concerns even when you're not completely certain. Rebecca clicked to her final slide, a photo of herself in uniform on Flight 447, taken by a passenger on that day 15 years ago. Young, uncertain, making the hardest decision of her career. This is me 15 years ago, standing in the galley, debating whether to report what I'd heard. You can't see it in the photo, but I was terrified. Terrified of being wrong. Terrified of the consequences. Terrified of making the wrong choice. She paused. But I was more terrified of what would happen if I stayed silent and people died because of my inaction. So I chose vigilance over comfort. I chose action over passivity. I chose courage over fear. Rebecca's voice softened. That's all any of us can do. Make the hard choice when it matters. Pay attention when it would be easier to ignore. Act when it would be more comfortable to look away. Trust that doing the right thing, even when you're scared, is worth it. She looked at the photo one more time. I don't know if I'd make the same choice today. I hope I would. I hope that if faced with a similar situation, I'd still have the courage to report what concerned me. But I can't know for sure. What I do know is that I'm grateful I made that choice 15 years ago. Because of that choice, thousands of people are alive who would be dead. That's worth any doubt, any fear, any discomfort I felt. Rebecca looked at the audience. Be the person who makes that choice. Be the one who pays attention. Be the one who reports concerns. Be the one who chooses vigilance even when it's hard. Because somewhere, someday, that choice might save thousands of lives. 15 years ago, I overheard a conversation on an airplane. I could have ignored it. I could have convinced myself it was nothing. I could have chosen comfort over action. But I didn't. I reported what I heard, and that choice changed everything. Make that choice. When the moment comes, and it will come, make the hard choice. Pay attention. Speak up. Act. That's how we keep each other safe. One vigilant person at a time. The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. Afterward, dozens of people approached Rebecca with their own stories. Threats they'd identified, attacks they'd prevented, lives they'd saved by applying the principles she'd taught. Each story reminded Rebecca why that moment of doubt 15 years ago had been worth pushing through, why the fear of being wrong was worth risking for the possibility of being right, why paying attention and reporting concerns, even when uncertain, was the right choice. As Rebecca left the conference that evening, she thought about Flight 447 one more time, about the 2 men in row 12, about the conversation she'd overheard, about the choice she'd made. She was just a flight attendant. She'd just been doing her job. She'd just paid attention and reported what concerned her. But that simple act, noticing, caring, reporting, had saved thousands of lives and created a legacy of vigilance that would protect countless more. Sometimes the most powerful actions are the simplest ones. Sometimes the biggest impact comes from the smallest choice. Sometimes saving the world means just paying attention and speaking up. Rebecca smiled. That was a lesson worth learning. That was a legacy worth leaving. That was everything. This story is dedicated to every flight attendant, pilot, air marshal, and aviation security professional who watches over passengers every day. Your vigilance protects us all. Thank you for paying attention, trusting your instincts, and having the courage to act when something seems wrong. You are the quiet guardians who keep millions of travelers safe.
Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.